But I just find it so interesting the way that some of these apologists go so hard on trying to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, do you really think that that's gonna be the thing that changes somebody's mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's what Jesus was doing.
No,
Verily I say unto you, premise one. Hard. I'm interested in what your view of hell was at the time when you said that most people are probably going to hell. What did you think hell was at the time when you were around 20?
I had talked myself into, mostly as a result of that struggle I was having, that it was probably some sort of, I basically became, without really reading too much about it,
Mm-hmm.
an annihilationist.
Yeah.
And so just the idea that people who don't know God, who are not his children, will probably go through some sort of torment, but it won't be forever, and then they will cease to exist.
Yeah, and that hell is, I mean, annihilationism is the view that people will be annihilated if they don't go to heaven. They sort of cease to exist, maybe after a period of suffering of some sort.
Right.
I've always been quite attracted to that idea because of the classical Thomistic arguments for the existence of God, which have God as the ground of being.
Mm-hmm.
If God is the foundation of being itself and everything that is participates in him, then if hell is something like separation from God, and if God is the ground of all being, then what does it mean to not be with God? It means to not be. It means to not exist.
Yeah, right.
So I've always thought philosophically there's good grounding for considering separation with God to be the same thing as not existing. Because to exist is to participate in God's existence, as some of the classical philosophers would put it.
Yeah.
But that's not as motivational as the fire and brimstone
Yeah.
imagery. And presumably in your outreach, you wouldn't push too heavy on the hell stuff, especially considering that you thought most people were going there anyway and there's nothing they could do about
right. And I think that it's interesting to see. I'm still a fan of Christian apologetics. It's fascinating to me to see the way that, and especially now, there wasn't nearly as much just apologetics media as there is now when I was deconstructing, because this mostly happened to me in the late aughts and 2010, 2011. And nobody was there were people writing books, but nobody was making internet content about this stuff. But I kind of dip in and dip out, and to see the way the conversation around hell is evolving is fascinating, because it is a really, it's like if you're selling a product, it's like the one thing where we get all the bad reviews about this. It's like, oh shit, people keep talking about this one thing, and it's the hell thing. So how do we rebrand hell? And the way that hell is being rebranded is smart. A lot of people are moving into this, annihilationism, but also there are people who just frame it as separation from God. It's just simply like you rejected God's love. Like, that's not hateful for him to say, well, now you just are going to be on your own and whatever that is to deal with your own stuff. And it sounds a lot nicer. It just sounds like you're just rejecting something. And I think that's become a pretty big talking point.
Yeah. What, maybe this was one of them, but when do the dominoes start to fall over for you? How old are you, and what starts to happen? Because right now you're speaking past tense. So at some point you go from not just Christian, but really involved professional Christian, as you put it, to now where you are. Where does this start?
So in my early 20s, the first couple of years out of school, I'm an engineer, civil engineer. I'm still very involved in Campus Crusade at the time. I'm not having that many, existential questions about it. If anything, I'm thinking about how I'm moving towards being a professional Christian, because my wife was still in college at the time. And so Lincoln and I had kind of, we've been best friends since first grade, 1984. So we kind of knew what we were working towards. And the idea that we were going to develop this ministry where we got to be funny and make our comedy videos. And we were really trying to find a way to do the thing that we loved for the cause that we loved.
So it sort of started as with God in the periphery here, of with all the video stuff, and it's all sort of directed towards, at least subtly to some degree, evangelism.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was a way to have my cake and eat it too, because I really wanted, we are entertainers at heart. We wanted to be filmmakers. We wanted to make things that, had significance culturally. We wanted to do that from the very beginning. So we always had our minds of on this idea that maybe we'll kind of, we can use this ministry, or we can have a ministry where we're doing these things that we love, and then maybe something that we make will be impactful enough so that we could one day, maybe we'll move to Hollywood and maybe we'll have a ministry there just through the things that we create. That was sort of the thought in the early days. So shortly after the engineering stint, going staff with Campus Crusade, at that point, you're going to the staff training and you're taking the seminary classes and your initial, and I was always I was not like a super deep student of theology, but I would say moderately. deep, and there were certain ideas that I would gravitate towards and things that I like to think about and talk about. At that same time, I was given a book, and I never really thought about the intersection of science and faith. I think the way that I would have described it is, I think that most scientists are not Christians. Most scientists are atheists, and they've come up with some pretty wacky ideas to try to explain the world and why people are the way that they are, why the world is the way that it is. And they're mostly just desperate attempts to explain the world without God's involvement. So that whole thing about evolution and how long the world has been here, that's probably all BS. But I didn't think about it any more deeply than that. I wasn't like a staunch young earth creationist. I didn't think about that issue in particular. But I picked up a book from an astronomer, Hugh Ross. And I'm sure, I've mentioned this before, and he has a Christian ministry that is like very anti-evolution, but very pro old universe from the standpoint of astronomy, which, obviously when you look at all the astronomical evidence and the speed of light and the size of the universe and all this stuff, the universe has been around for probably as long as the scientists are saying. But then he went on to essentially say that, but all truth is God's truth, and this is totally compatible with the Bible. But just so you know, evolution didn't happen. He was a proponent of something called progressive creationism, which essentially was, yes, the world has been around for as long as the scientists say.
Right.
And these fossils we find are legitimate fossils that are approximately the date that they're saying they are. But God was creating new batches of creatures, special creations at different stages throughout the history of the world.
Whoa.
And then ultimately resulting in the creation of people.
So why?
Great question. Great question. So I remember thinking as I'm reading this, I'm like, it's the first time I ever thought about there being some reconciliation between what we observe in science and my belief about the world. And I just remember thinking, this doesn't feel like a good explanation.
I've never heard of somebody. I mean, I'm sure I've met someone who probably believes that the Earth is old and the universe is old, but maybe is suspicious of evolution. But specifically well, I'm a scientist and I'm an astronomer, and there's just no way I can look at the redshifting of the galaxies and deny that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. But that evolution stuff from that other field of biology that I've probably never really seriously studied, that's all BS. And instead, I mean, God is just creating animals willy-nilly.
When you listen to Rhett talk about hell, you can hear why leaving Christianity was the honest move. He admits he slowly talked himself into annihilationism. Why? Because eternal torture didn't sit right. And that's important. If a core doctrine of your faith feels morally wrong, and you have to reshape it to make it tolerable, that's already a red flag. The Bible is not vague about hell. Matthew 25:46 says, eternal punishment. Revelation 14:11 says, the smoke of their torment rises forever. Those verses don't describe people quietly fading out of existence. So when modern Christians soften hell into just separation, or just ceasing to exist, that's not a small tweak. That's a major shift away from traditional doctrine. And that's the inconsistency. Either the text means what it says, or it doesn't. If eternal conscious torment is morally disturbing, and for many people it is, then questioning the system that produced it makes sense.
And what I kept finding is that Christian apologetics, it really consists of people who are like, well, the truth cannot be questioned. The truth, we've predetermined that this is true. And now we've got to find a way to buttress that truth. And there's a tenor to those arguments that they don't hold up very well under scrutiny. When you get the answer to the answer to the answer to the answer, you just keep finding it just seems like these people seem to be interested in what actually happened. And these people seem to be interested in the truth that they hope that happened. And that was a huge flip for me because again, as a Christian, what I thought is we have the truth. They have the desperate attempt to be anti-God, right? We were taught that these evolutionists, these professors who are teaching this kind of stuff, they're sinful. They're deceived. They desperately don't want God to exist. So therefore, they got to come up with these ideas in order to explain them away. But when you're like, actually, first of all, most of these ideas came from Christians. The age of the earth, these geologists back in the day, these were just most people were Christians. It's just the fact of the matter. And they were like, oh, God must have done it in this way.
Yeah.
And then when they find evolution, okay, God must have done it in this way. And so the scientific stuff, there were plenty of people who taught me it's okay. You can believe that. You can be a theistic evolutionist. you probably still need to believe in a literal Adam and Eve because the atonement still needs to make sense. Original sin's got to make sense. And I was like, okay, yeah, those arguments seem like we're just trying to marry two disparate ideas.
Yeah.
But I was like, okay. But I just think that mentality of finding that the people, because it got into biblical scholarship after that. It got into, okay, well, the primeval history, this is allegory? Like this didn't happen? These are religious myths that were adapted from other myths that were around at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The flood didn't happen.
Yeah.
The Tower of Babel is a weird explanation for language. I started seeing all that, and so I was like, okay, now my entire view of the beginning of the Bible is different. And again, I would go to the apologetics answer, and I would be like, one person seems to be, like the critical scholars actually seem to be like interested in what happened. Like, why did these people write this? Why is it like this? Where did this idea come from? And then the Christian apologists seem to be like, well, we know it's God's word, so how do we prove it?
Mm-hmm.
And it just kept creeping closer and closer to Jesus. And I had this this was years, right? Because I was like, well, I'm not going to stop believing in Jesus. You can have these weird ideas about the Old Testament, but like Jesus is different. I mean, I have a personal relationship with him, and and that stuff's true, right? The stuff about the resurrection, my arguments for why the resurrection had happened, and it being the best explanation for the beginning of the church and all this. I've like had those arguments in my back pocket. But long story short, eventually those arguments fell victim to the same type of critique. They're a little bit different because I do think that there's a more interesting conversation around the resurrection because you can kind of know a little bit less about what happened. And you can be somebody who believes all this stuff about that I might agree with related to evolution, but then be like, I have a faith position that Jesus actually rose from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
I recognize that it's not a scientific thing. I can't prove it. It is a little bit different category. But it opened me up to questioning these sacred ideas. And it's just the most sacred idea of all that Jesus was the Son of God who raised from the dead eventually was the last domino to fall.
Wow. And how does that finally fall? I mean, because the evolution thing confronts, and I think the reason why it was so scandalous in the 19th century is kind of just a vibe shift, right? Because when you speak to philosophically minded Christians, they will quite correctly say, there is no argumentative syllogism you can construct which shows that because animals have a common ancestor, therefore God doesn't exist. That doesn't follow. There's no argument you can make from that. But it's hard to put into words just like the feeling. Again, it's like we were saying before about the indicating a direction of thought. When a society is based upon the idea that human beings are special and unique.
Yeah.
This idea, if you're smart, it doesn't need to undermine the idea that God exists, but it shows this direction of thought, like, oh gosh, we're not as special as we thought we were, and where's that going to lead? I'm pretty sure that in the first edition of The Origin of Species in 1859, that beautiful ending, there is grandeur in this view of life from many different species, whatever it is, having been breathed into many lives or into one, have been and are being evolved. And there's that phrase, like having been breathed into one or to many, primordial forms of life. And presumably because of the backlash that this idea receives in the second edition of The Origin of Species, having been breathed by the creator into one life or to many, Darwin defaced the ending, his moving ending to The Origin of Species. And I think by edition 3, it was back out again. So you can, I've seen one in person, an actual second edition at like a rare bookshop. If you happen to be in like a fancy rare bookshop and see if they've got a second edition, it will say by the creator, because there's just something so confronting about it that you need to respond to. But okay, there's that. And then there's the resurrection. That's not just like a vibe shift. This is the historical claim upon which Christianity is based. And like you say, it's less accessible to the scientific method because it's a singular event.
Yeah.
It's not like a process that's still going on today that we can biologically observe. And you can't scientifically or historically prove the resurrection, but you can prove like surrounding facts. You can say that Jesus was crucified, that his disciples claimed to see him, all of this kind of stuff. All of those arguments are still there and still sat in your mind. Presumably you're pretty familiar with them as someone who specializes in outreach. Why would that change? Like what shifts the dial on those kinds of arguments for you?
And this is where I don't remember specifically like, okay, well, it was this book, but it could be something as simple. It was one aspect of that argument, of that case. Probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie?
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective.
Rhett realized Christian apologetics begins with the conclusion already locked in. The Bible is true. Jesus rose. Now build arguments around that. That approach is completely different from how science works, where you follow evidence even if it leads somewhere uncomfortable. Look at the pattern. Genesis doesn't match geology. It becomes allegory. The flood has no global evidence. It's symbolic. Babel doesn't line up with linguistics. It's a story with a message. But Paul's argument in Romans depends on a real Adam for original sin to work. Then, the resurrection. The argument that the disciples wouldn't die for a lie sounds strong at first. But historically, we don't have solid documentation that most of them were executed for something they knew was false. And even if they believed it, people throughout history have died for beliefs that weren't true.
I'm a skeptic in that regard, but I just find it so interesting the way that some of these apologists go so hard on trying to prove it. It's like, you really think that that's gonna be the thing that changes somebody's mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's what Jesus was doing.
No,
verily I say unto you, premise one.
Yeah, he wasn't doing apologetics.
It doesn't work like that. It's clearly like not what it's all about.
Right.
And apologetics can only take you so far. I mean, there is this idea online in particular that to be a Christian or to be religious is to essentially do natural theology, is what they call it, which is like arguing for the existence of God. Like, the whole religion discussion has become consumed with God's existence, biblical scholarship, and we forget that it's actually an assumption, and a controversial assumption, that is the approach to have to this conversation. For many people, like, natural theology is just a waste of time and an improper approach to the question of God's existence. And most people who have a religious experience will report that. Thomas Aquinas famously didn't finish the Summa Theologica, the greatest Christian metaphysician of all time. And he doesn't finish it because he's performing Mass, he's performing the Eucharist, and he has a religious experience.
Right.
And his like friend or colleague or whatever is like writing to him, begging him, you have to finish this, Thomas. Like, this is, you've got to finish. And he says, I can write no more. It's all straw compared to what I've seen. And you're right about the double standard as well. I just had a Mormon on my show, Jacob Hansen, who, one of the key things that he likes to emphasize, he doesn't usually speak to atheists. This is quite funny. I saw him recently, and he says he doesn't usually speak to atheists because there are so many like metaphysical assumptions you have to make. If you want to talk about Mormonism, you already sound absolutely mental. If you're talking to someone who doesn't even already believe in like angels and God and stuff, you're not going to move an inch. But he's like, I always talk to Christians because they do believe in angels and revelation and prophets and all this kind of stuff. And he can kind of like hold up a mirror to these Christians because they look at him and be like, oh yeah, so like, you know, God spoke to some dude in upstate New York through some like golden plates that like no one's ever seen, you know, and he's like, yeah, well, how many witnesses do you have to the resurrection that left any accounts?
Right.
Like, we've got more eyewitness testimony to the golden plates than you've got to the resurrection, you know? And it's this like, obviously I can look at this and think both of them are, you know, not quite hitting the mark.
Right.
But his big gripe is like, I don't mind people saying that we don't have enough evidence or you're not convinced or whatever, but as a Christian, you can't switch that off when it comes to analyzing your own faith. And it does sound absurd to be like, oh, there was a prophet in New York, was there? But we've only just got used to the idea that religion comes from, you know, that it comes from the Middle East. The whole reason why Jesus is born of Nazareth is like a lowly origin. They even say in the Gospels, you know, is he the guy from Nazareth? You know, what good comes from Nazareth? We're just used to it now. But at the time, that would have sounded about as crackpot as saying, you know, this guy in upstate New York, yeah, he's found some golden plates and they're buried under the ground. And so I do find, like, I've talked about Mormonism a lot recently because I do find it holds up this interesting mirror to Christian apologetics. It's like, this is kind of how you sound, guys, a lot of the time. You know?
I certainly agree. It is this, and to have been on that side of it, and to, I mean, specifically, I don't still have that document that I wrote, the guide to talking to your Mormon friends.
That is a shame. I was going to ask.
I mean, it might be in some, you know, box somewhere, but I can tell you that it was incredibly dismissive. And I think that I was trying to be cute and funny at the same time. And so I'm sure I was like essentially saying, can you believe that people believe this? Like, if you only knew how crazy this set of beliefs was, you would basically deny it on that, the fact of how crazy it was. But it's like, it's not any crazier. It's just less familiar. You know, it's just less familiar than these things that we believe so wholeheartedly. Yeah, but at the time, you can't see it. When you're in it, you can't see it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
You said at the time you said you started believing in natural selection and your wife's in tears. Does that like put you off? Do you think, oh gosh, maybe I shouldn't dig any further? Is it already an unstoppable force? Like, how does that go? Because presumably she's kind of okay with the evolution thing now. So
She's more than okay with it at this point.
like how does that like begin to develop? Do you just kind of keep going and say like, sorry, darling, but this is what I think, and there's nothing I can do about it?
Yeah, it moved very slow because, again, I didn't have all these YouTubers talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I had to make the decision to be like, I'm going to buy this book and take the time to read it. And I'm still like living my life. I'm not like a voracious reader. I mean, I read quite a bit, but it's, it's pretty slow.
Mm-hmm.
And Link and I are trying to build a career, and we're trying to like make ends meet. And this is early days of YouTube. So I was a bit scared of where this might lead. And I think I just had this idea, because again, where we come from, everyone else in our families are not just Christians, but they're strong, committed Christians. This is the most important thing in their life. We grew up looking down on cultural Christians. We could spot them. Now, that person just goes to church because it's the thing to do. But we go to church because this is the most important thing that we could do, is having communion with other believers. And so I think that it moved very slowly because of that. I was getting into the historical Jesus stuff in like 2010.
Mm-hmm.
I like looking back at some of my journal entries, and that was when it was beginning to kind of fall apart. Like the Jesus part was falling apart. But we moved to LA in 2011. So one of the things that happened, Link and I had a series where we were making these local commercials. Several of them had gone viral in like the late aughts. And we ended up getting a TV show on IFC. That's why we moved out here. So we moved out here with our wives and kids all together in 2011. And I kind of thought to myself, this is maybe an opportunity to start over a little bit. We went to a church that we had some friends at that we knew from out here. And it was in Hollywood, and it was like the music was awesome and everyone was so cool, and they wore like the cool hats. It was like hipster church, and it was so much different than what I came from.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they talked about these issues was just more nuanced and gray. And I found myself thinking like, I think I could do this.
Mm-hmm.
I think I could do this because, I guess ultimately if you backed this person into a corner, the pastor would probably believe all the stuff that I believe, but holding it a little bit more loosely, and maybe I can kind of have this thing like, I love Jesus. And I remember writing in my journal, when Peter talks about, when Jesus is asking him if he's going to leave, and he's like, well, where else would I go?
Yeah.
I thought the same thing. I was like, what am I going to do? Become an atheist? Become non-religious? Become a different religion? It's just like, even if I'm not sure about this, I'm sure that Jesus is good for me.
Yeah.
I'm sure that these ideas are good for me, and this idea of believing in resurrection and like this, I can kind of just maintain this. That's where I was when I moved out here. That lasted such a short period of time because when I would stop and I would just think about it, I would be like, yeah, but it's probably not true. And I started finding people who had been through similar things I could talk to about these things.
Mm-hmm.
And you start just finding there's people who have, and also I started finding people, I can't remember exactly, they weren't really talking about it on YouTube, but there were people writing about it in blogs and that kind of thing. And you just start finding, oh, these people don't believe this anymore, but they're still good people who want the same thing out of life. Because my wife and I thought our marriage would end. We thought we wouldn't have anything useful to share with our children. When you believe this idea that you've got the truth and that this is the most essential truth, and it isn't just about your salvation, it's about your life. Like your marriage is based on this commitment to Christ first.
Yeah.
Your kids and every decision that you make about them is based on this biblical understanding and this framework. You're going to throw that out. What are you going to do? What's going to happen to your marriage? What's going to happen to your kids? But then you start finding all these people who don't know what they think about it anymore, and they like still have solid marriages, and their kids are still good kids who are just trying the best that they can. And so I think that about 1 or 2 years into being out here, when I was kind of like, okay, I just don't believe this at all. I'm not going to call myself a Christian. But maybe we'll keep going to church for a while I try to figure out what we're going to do about the kids.
Yeah.
Christians will aggressively question Mormonism. Golden plates? Sounds ridiculous. A prophet in New York? Where's the proof? But the moment you apply that same level of skepticism to Christianity, empty tomb stories written decades later, miracle claims, angel visits. Suddenly you're told you're being unfair. That's the double standard. And then apologetics turns into this intellectual arms race. Arguments about God's existence, historical minimal facts, natural theology. But most believers didn't arrive at faith through syllogisms. It was culture, family, experience. Even Rhett admits apologetics only goes so far. Then there's evolution. No, it doesn't logically disprove God, but it completely undercuts the idea that humans are uniquely handcrafted in a sudden act. The evidence for common ancestry, genetics, fossil record, observable natural selection, is overwhelming. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, the shifting doctrines, the double standards, the way interpretations stretch to keep the core intact, you've got to ask yourself something honest. If another religion made the same claims with the same level of evidence, would you believe it? Or would you demand more? Was Rhett right to leave when it stopped making sense to him? Or do you think he walked away too quickly? Let me know in the comments. I really want to hear your take. And if you appreciate direct breakdowns like this, where we actually look at the claims and the evidence, make sure you like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these conversations going.